Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. I've never really shared this story before, mainly because it still causes me mental distress every time that I think about it, even all these years later. But after reading a bunch of other stories posted in this group and seeing that a lot of people have gone through terrible things, some of them even similar to mine, I decided that I should put it out there and see if it helps me get past it. Maybe it will help others see the severity of obsessive behavior, and if it helps anyone, that would be an added bonus in my mind. Back when I was in high school, there was this kid named Carter who was always a bit odd and out there. He was quiet, very quiet. He kept to himself for the most part, but he had a bit of a fascination with me, in that where he never really spoke to anyone else. He always treated me like I was a good friend, like we talked all the time. Now, I didn't mind Carter. He seemed like an okay person, but outside of that, I never really paid much attention to him, assuming that he was just shy and that he might have a bit of a crush on me or something. I figured that it was completely harmless and that it would pass and that would be that. However, of course, that's not how things went. What started as him just having that small crush turned into him getting a bit creepy. He started seeming to always be around, seemingly by coincidence. He'd be in the hallways nearby when I walked to class, and at lunch, he would sit at the table next to where I was, regardless of who was sitting there. Or he would stand with his back against the wall near the table if there were people already there. He joined the drama club randomly, and he would be there every day after school when the meetings would occur. I just tried to pretend that it had nothing to do with me, and that I was just noticing a bunch of coincidental occurrences, and that he wasn't doing it to be around me. But then, the notes started. There was a random note in my locker one day, handwritten and not signed, and it was filled with a bunch of compliments and declarations of love. Flattering, sure, but it was cringe-inducing too. It had compliments about random things that really didn't make sense to me, like the straightness of my teeth and how I walked. And, of course, that wasn't the only one. Oh no, it happened every single day for a few days. Then, a few days where there were multiples, and it just started getting beyond unsettling. They started to mention details about my life that no one should have known. Specifically, one mentioned the color of the underwear that I was wearing that day, and how it matched the color of my bed covers. Worse yet, it was completely accurate. When I read that, I started to feel sick in my stomach, realizing that this guy was stalking me. I could no longer pretend that it was all a coincidence. I had to accept and address that this boy was pushing boundaries. I will say that I was only 16, and I really didn't know what to do about it beyond telling an adult, and I figured that I should tell my school counselor since it was technically happening at school. So I went to my counselor and I explained everything that was going on, and I gave her those notes, including those last ones that I mentioned. She read them, and after getting through it and taking a few minutes to think about it, she looked at me and said, "And you think that you know who sent these?" I told her that it was Carter, and she asked me how I knew for sure. I tried to explain that he was stalking me, that he was always around and such, but she mentioned that none of those letters were signed and that I couldn't just accuse him without being able to prove it. I asked how I was supposed to prove it, and she just shrugged me off, saying that as serious as this sounded, there was nothing to show that it was actually him and that I should talk to him about it. She seriously recommended that I talk to him about this whole thing and that I talk to him about how obsessive he was about the fact that he had obviously been peeping in my bedroom window at some point. That wasn't going to happen, obviously, so I walked out of that room and I finished my day, and when I got home, I just went and lay down in my bed and sobbed. I was feeling paranoid, freaked out, like he was watching me while I was sitting there crying. I kept glancing out of my window thinking that I would see him, thinking that he would be right there for some reason. And when my dad got home, he asked me what was going on, and I explained the whole thing to him, and I even told him that I tried to talk to my school counselor and that she basically told me that she couldn't do anything about it. He was shocked and angry, and when I told him about the counselor and he read the part about how he was looking in my room, he became absolutely furious. He told me that he was going to talk to the counselor the next morning. And so the next day, he drove me to school and he went in to talk to her. And when he came out, it was pretty clear that everyone was unhappy. He told me that I was going to be staying home from school that day, and then we left. When we got home, he told some of what was said, and he mentioned that the counselor was going to have a conversation with Carter and said things would be okay. The day when I went back, I was nervous that I was going to run into Carter in the hallways. But from what I could tell, he wasn't at school, which made me feel a bit better. Well, that is, until I got home. When I got home from school, as was normal, my parents weren't home. So I went in, grabbed something to eat, and then I sat in the living room to watch some TV. After about 20 minutes, I heard something in the garage like something had fallen down, and without even thinking, I got up to see what exactly it was. When I opened the door, my heart dropped. There, in the middle of the garage, was Carter, just standing there trying to pick up what he had knocked down. He looked up at me and gave me this horrible grin, and then immediately started toward the door. Thankfully, there were two things that were going to be my saving grace. The door upstairs from the garage had a deadbolt lock on it, and my dad was going to be home within only a couple of minutes. So I slammed the door and I locked it with a deadbolt and knob lock, and after a couple of minutes, I could hear Carter smacking the door and telling me that I needed to let him in, and that he loved me, and that I needed to let him be close to me. With the door locked, there was only one way out of the garage, and that was through the garage door, which was now opening because my dad was pulling in. I heard my dad pulling into the garage, and I heard the door open, and I heard my dad shouting at Carter, yelling at him to get on the ground, and Carter said that he wasn't there to do anything wrong. That would have been believable had he not somehow broken into the garage to wait for me to get home. A bit after this, my dad told me to call the police and tell them that Carter had broken into our home. So long story short, the police did show up. I explained what had happened and that I had come home and found him in the garage. After a lot of talking to the cops and then putting Carter into the back of the car, I was just sitting there and staring at him in the back of the police car as they asked questions and got more info. The police then pulled off, and I had never been happier than that day. Thankfully, that was pretty much the end of it. I don't know how far into the legal system Carter ended up getting, but I never saw him at school again. Obviously, I never got another note in my locker, and I never had to deal with his craziness again, and my life got back on track almost immediately. I'm thankful that my dad took me seriously, and screw that counselor for not even thinking to address the whole thing beyond saying, "Oh, we can't prove it." And Carter, I'm glad that you and I never met again. And stay the hell away from me. Back when I was younger, my mom had a garage sale every summer. I had 3 older brothers and I was the only girl, so hand-me-downs weren't really a thing for me. So after my last brother couldn't fit into the clothes or shoes anymore, they were in the sale. I honestly enjoyed helping my mom on these, as it was like playing a real-life shopkeeper. I used to play that with my brothers a lot as kids. I also had the genius idea, like a lot of kids did, to sell lemonade and cookies too. When I got a little older, I think I was around 14 or 15, I was always trying to make my own money. So when my mom offered to give me the money that I made on my stuff, I agreed to sell a lot more. I had some old clothes that I didn't want to get rid of, even though they didn't fit me, or even if they were torn up. They held good memories, so I didn't want to part with it. I also had some toys that I didn't play with that I kept for similar reasons. My mom did not like the clutter, so any extra stuff that wasn't necessary, she always tried to get rid of. So I pulled out all of those stuff that I didn't need anymore, and she set up a table specifically for my stuff, and they had all the pink stickers on it, so that we knew that it belonged to me. Well, I was ready to collect shopping funds. The sales started slow, but it was alright. I sat out there by the cash box, typically doing stuff on my phone while my mom organized and put more stuff out and mingled with the neighborhood shoppers. But at one point, there was a guy that showed up alone in a small convertible. He looked normal. He was in jeans and a t-shirt and just slowly made his way to each table and bin that my mom had set out. He paused at the box of my dad's stuff, which I think had some old tools and shoes in it. And then he walked by the table that had my brother's clothes on it. He picked up a couple pairs of pants and it looked like he checked the sizes, and then he folded them back up and laid them on the table. The next table had my mom's clothes and my clothes on it. He again picked up a few items, and one of those was a pair of my old jeans. I remember him holding them out and looking them up and down, almost as if he was inspecting them. Then he flipped them over to the back and kind of smirked. I figured that it was because the back had something written across the pockets like Angel. He looked around and noticed that I was making eye contact with him, and then he smiled. I smiled back, but then I quickly looked back down at my phone, thinking that it was awkward of me to stare. I knew it had been a few minutes because I had been watching a video that I was in the middle of. He walked over to me and said hello, and I responded. He asked if I was the manager, joking around, and I said that my mom was, but that I was just watching over as she got more stuff. He asked a few innocent questions about the day and about me, but it was nothing weird, so I just answered. I remember even making a comment about his car because I thought it looked very cool. It was a deep purple color. He looked over at the car, then back at me, and smiled and said since I like it, he could take me for a drive in it if I wanted to. Now, even though he didn't seem weird and nothing felt off, I knew better, so I just smiled and said thanks, but no thanks. He then asked if I was selling any of my stuff, and I confirmed. I pointed to the table as he had already looked at my pants. I also remember this because I felt my stuff was pretty obvious. My mom was out there when he got there, and it's pretty obvious that we were 2 different sizes. The tables were also sorted out by the type of clothing and sizing, as my mom was a neat freak. So he smiled again, thanking me, and then walked back over to the table with my stuff. I snuck a few glances up from my phone to see him still looking at my clothes. I thought that it was kind of weird that he was looking at my clothes and no one else's. But I also tried to be reasonable in thinking that maybe he had a daughter around the same age too. But then, the guy came back over to me and had a few more questions. This time, they seemed a bit more intrusive. He asked how old I was, and I answered honestly. He asked me how tall I was, and I again was honest. But then he asked me what size I wore, which was weird because if I told you where my clothes were, you could check the sizes on them and assume that I'm probably around that size. So, I just told him the same size on the pants that he was holding. He kind of laughed a bit, and I guess he could sense my uneasiness and claimed that he was thinking about his daughter. I thought it was still possible, so I just tried to be polite, but I was also feeling awkward at this point. He stood there for a moment, so I was expecting him to walk away, but instead, he leaned down towards my face, looked around, and then quietly asked, "Are you getting rid of any old sports bras?" I wanted to yell at this guy, but I was also afraid that he might try to do something. If he was brazen enough to ask me that with other people around, what else would he be willing to do? However, my dad was in the garage behind me talking to someone as I could hear his voice, so I decided to take a chance and call this guy out. "No, I'm not selling my underwear to you, you creep!" I loudly shouted. This was the exact reaction I was hoping for. I looked back at my dad, who was already quickly walking towards the front, and the guy dropped the items he was holding on the table in front of me and started walking away and looked at another table. He really thought that he was going to be able to play the whole situation off. My dad immediately approached him, shoved him back a bit, and then told him to leave. No questions, no nothing. He just told him to get the hell out of our property right there. The guy walked back to his car, holding his hands up and looked offended, like my dad was in the wrong. He quickly burned out while other shoppers looked around at him and started asking questions. I explained to my dad what happened, and he made my oldest brother sit out there with me while he went in and told my mom about what happened. He didn't want me out there alone, nor did I want to be alone. It wasn't even that long after that they both came back out the front door. We were all talking and helping people pay and leave when I looked up to see a purple convertible driving by real slowly. Before I could even say anything, my dad looked up too and noticed and shouted something out to the guy, causing him to again take off. My brother was ready to go follow this guy in his own car, but my dad stopped him. Instead, he did call the cops to report him, which we did. They said they would drive around a few times, but said that if we saw him again, to call 911 immediately and they could patch him to one of the officers so they could try to stop him if he was out front. At this point, he was being intimidating, and with what he said to me and the fact that he was bordering on trespassing, they took it very seriously. We ended up putting all our stuff away early because we didn't want to give that guy something to look at, but we didn't see him again that day. However, my mom was going to try the sale again the next day, but I didn't want to be out there, so I ended up staying inside and cleaned and organized my room. And yet, the same creep drove by again. I was getting pretty worried about this. And every bump that night had me wide awake thinking that this guy was going to come back. My dad was getting pretty angry too. He ended up sitting in his car, parked on the street across from my house, and waited for that guy to drive by. My room faces out into the front yard, so I could hear him talking to my mom and brother about it, while my window was open and could see him sitting in his car. I guess that must have really spooked the guy because he was brave enough to drive by one more time and my dad was ready to follow him. I heard my mom shout and the convertible guy burned out again, and then my dad followed them. We had more cops over as my mom explained to them what happened. I don't remember how long it was when my dad finally came back. He said that he followed him for a while until he got on the highway going some pretty dangerous speeds. My dad wasn't willing to humor that, so he slowed down and then came back home. As far as I know, they never caught the guy, but we never saw him again after that. The conversation that I had with him was creepy enough, but knowing that he was driving past our home, not only on the day of, but the day after that encounter, was pretty disturbing. It still creeps me out thinking about what his intentions were, but thankfully, we never saw him again after that. I just hope that he didn't try to do that or anything else to another unsuspecting girl. A few years ago, I used to live in an apartment complex that was attached to a really nice public park, one that was surrounded entirely with a walking path that broke away at one part to go into a wooded area. I've walked this park hundreds of times, like literally hundreds of times. I used to walk that park every single day after work for a couple of years. It was one of the safest places that I've ever walked, and honestly, I never expected anything to happen to me while I walked it. But the day that this happened, my illusion of how safe it was definitely shattered. I was about halfway through my usual route, which included about half of the branch path that took me out into the forest. I didn't like to do the whole thing because it went too far out for me, but I would go until I reached the benches, which would be the halfway mark, and then I would turn around to head home. I was minding my own business when I started to get this weird feeling like someone was watching or following me. You know, that creepy crawling sensation that just makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I just tried to shake it off, thinking that I was just a bit anxious or that maybe there was a person there, but they were just walking too. But after a few more minutes, I started to feel a bit worse. I was thinking that I was being paranoid until I turned around and saw that there was a guy that was standing on the side of the path, looking around like he had lost something. But then every few moments, he would glance up in my direction. He was a bit overweight, wearing a white and green tracksuit. I slowed down as I walked and half turned to look at the guy and make sure that he knew that I saw him. And as soon as I did, this guy stopped looking at the ground and then stood straight up, gave me a small wave and said, "Oh, hey." I didn't reply. I just stood where I was and I gave a small wave back. And as soon as I did, he nodded and then he laughed and then started stepping towards me at an escalated pace. My instincts kicked in and I took off down the path, starting at a medium run. But when I looked back and saw that this guy was now chasing me as fast as he could, I took off into a full sprint. For a few moments, this guy was running at me, and I was running away. Thankfully, I was definitely faster than he was, as I was able to get back to the part of the path that branched off. I ducked down into some of the thicker bushes, hiding and seeing if this guy was going to follow me this far. And after a couple more seconds, he actually did run down to the split, and he slowed down to a walk as he caught his breath and then tried to look around. I just sat there. I ducked down into these bushes, feeling my heart pound so hard that I thought I might throw up, watching this guy look around the paths. And then I heard something that completely confirmed all of my fears. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, pressed a button on the screen, and started talking. I couldn't make out the full conversation, but I heard enough to know that this situation was as terrifying as I thought it was. He said, "Hey, yeah, I lost her." His voice was frustrated and angry, and I knew for a fact, had I not gotten away from this guy, bad things would have happened. After a few more words, he hung up and yelled a few curse words out into the woods, and then he slowly walked back the way that he had came. I stayed hidden in those bushes for a while until it clicked in my mind that I should probably call 911. I pulled out my phone and dialed it, and I explained to them that there was a guy on the walking path that had been chasing me, and I also explained what he had said on the phone. The woman said that they would send some police out to the park and to meet them there if possible. I got out of the hiding spot when I was certain that he was in fact gone from there, and then I walked back toward my building. I waited in the parking lot of the property for a while, and in an incredibly disappointing twist, the police never showed up. Well, my guess is that they got a call that was more important than the weird man followed me in the park, but I would have at least liked a call back or something. But of course, that didn't happen. The whole thing really messed me up, and I never was back to that park. I ended up taking my walks around the parking lot of my apartment complex because I just couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods just in case. It's scary to think about what might have happened had he gotten a hold of me, but thankfully that didn't happen at all. I have no idea what happened, and honestly, I hope that no one ever ended up in the situation that I did. And I hope that I never run into him ever again. And to everyone else, be careful, stay aware, because you never know who might be watching. This happened towards the end of my senior year of high school, and unfortunately, is something that was just as memorable as the rest of the year. I will not be sharing my location or school, and any names that I use will be fake because technically, I was not the victim here, so I don't want to invade their privacy any more than I already have. But I still feel that it's important to share this story as a way of helping others and to stress the importance of, if you see something, say something. I don't know if it's the same for other high schools, but it was quite common for the seniors to pull some kind of massive prank on the school as a whole. They were supposed to be harmless. It was like a universal rule so that no one got kicked out or suspended. It was also typically done around spring break, giving them time to execute it. So, to keep with the tradition, several of us seniors, including myself, started plotting our scheme. The school was going to look like a glitter bomb went off in it. We had tons of glitter and confetti that we had just bought from random party stores and a few bulk bags on eBay for a stupidly cheap, possibly shady price. One of my friends, I'll call Jess, was our golden ticket as she was a teacher's aide, which meant he had access to the room that had all the spare keys to the classrooms. We started the day before spring break started. There were a lot of teachers and faculty there as they were probably wrapping things up for the break, so we waited outside in one of our cars while Jess went in to look like he was working on some last-minute things for a teacher. After a few hours, people started slowly leaving, so he let us in through the south door and then ushered us into different rooms to fulfill our plan. It started out completely smooth. We got through several classrooms, almost ran into one teacher, but managed to hide from them. We all even got a good laugh about it too. And then, we came across the classroom of Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson was the media teacher, and he was actually pretty cool. I guess when it's an elective, we tend to like those more anyways, right? The class was awesome. We made different media-related projects, such as our own radio broadcast. We recorded and put together a news session, including local and national news topics, some sports, and also the weather. It was actually a lot of fun and interesting, as Mr. Jackson used a lot of his own equipment, so we were working with some very expensive and high-tech cameras. We had microphones, and even the software was pretty advanced. Mr. Jackson was laid back too and easy to talk to when it came to anything from the assignments to more personal things. He was a bit of a prankster himself. When he caught someone sleeping, he would do harmless things such as having us all leave the room, turn the lights off, and have them wake up confused. Like I said, pretty harmless. So when we came across his room, I didn't want to do anything to the equipment, but I wanted to do something additional or extra to his room, knowing that he would appreciate the prank. I started looking around the room to get some ideas of what to do when I started going through his desk. In the bottom drawer, I found several tapes similar to the ones we used for our projects. In fact, I recognized the names of some of my classmates on them. However, I found 2 tapes that only had a label of Class of 92. This caught my attention because at that time of this event, it was not the year 92 or 93 or even the 90s for that matter. My curiosity was now piqued, and I decided to take one with me, thinking either I can use it for the prank or maybe it was a memorable class and I could do something special for him as a farewell/graduation gift. In regards to the prank, I just covered his desk with glitter and filled one of the tape cabinets with it too. I had 2 friends with me in that room that saw me with the tape and wanted to know what was on it as well, so I agreed to let them know or watch it with them if they wanted to. We left the school that evening with a successful mission, and then we agreed to watch the tape the next day at my place since I had a VCR in my room. However, I couldn't stop thinking about the tape and what could be on it, or what could be so important to keep that specific year. So I decided to watch it that night. I would just let my friends see it the next day. I know you all have probably already figured out where this is going, but to this day, I still fight myself if taking that tape was the right thing to do. The tape started during what appears to be a graduation ceremony, then cuts to that same classroom. The room was almost completely empty. A few people walked past the camera, and you could hear the door close. What was still on the camera was a girl in the second row from the front. Then, I watched Mr. Jackson walk by the camera towards the door, then started talking as he walked towards the girl. There was some innocent conversation occurring at first. He asked her how she was doing, how her older sister was, and even what her plans were for winter break. But then, the conversation changed to the homework or projects. She shyly asked him about how to do something, and he pulled out another camera as well as a sheet and then started explaining it. But while this was happening, is where my stomach started to drop. I saw Mr. Jackson place his hand on her knee, then said something quietly to her. I could see their faces, and she definitely did not seem interested in this or reciprocated in any way. There was some more one-sided conversation while his hand moved from her knee to her thigh. I was frozen with fear and disgust, and about 20 minutes, The tape cut back to the ceremony, and there was nothing else after that. It was pretty obvious what this was, and the ceremony was used as a mask. I was terrified. I knew Mr. Jackson, and in fact, I knew the girl in the video. We had a different class together, but I was only an acquaintance with her really. But I did have a friend that was pretty close to her. I didn't know what to do or who to show this to, since we technically shouldn't have been in the school at that time. I was still a kid, so I didn't know if I would get in trouble if I told them. Instead, I tried to ask my mutual friend to talk to her, but I tried to be vague, not wanting to talk about the situation. My mutual friend, Katie, did not take the media class, so I asked her to ask the girl about the class, ask her if she had any troubles and how she felt about the teacher or assignments. And the next day, Katie asked me if I was having troubles in the class because of the girl's reaction. She said that she thought the class was okay, but when she asked about the teacher, she got quiet and didn't want to talk about it, so she assumed that she wasn't doing well in it. The feeling of something being very wrong only got heavier in my mind. It was still spring break at that time, so I could only dwell on it. I even admitted to my friends that I tried watching it, but that something was wrong and it didn't work. I didn't want them to see it for their and more importantly for her sake. When we did return to school, I found myself watching him more closely and realized that he was the same as I remembered him. Except, I saw him glance over at the girl many times throughout the hour that we were in class. That night, when I went home, I told my parents everything. I told them about how I found the tape and what was on the tape. I gave it to them, but I don't know if they ever watched it. I assume they did, because what I accused the teacher of was very real and very serious. I can be quite the jokester and always try to keep the conversation lighthearted. This was not something I would even bring up in a joking manner, so I'm sure my parents trusted me on that front too. And they told me that they would take care of it and just to go to school as normal. The rest of that week, I tried my best to act normal, but it was hard to not want to go off on Mr. Jackson. It was hard not to want to go to that girl and tell her that I was sorry for what she went through. But I didn't. And thankfully, I only had to go 2 days like that. On the third day, we had a substitute teacher, and everyone took it at face value that we were just getting a free day. But I think I knew the real reason. The rest of the week continued with the same sub, and then we were told the next week that Mr. Jackson wouldn't be able to finish the school year. I was so relieved but also concerned, as the girl wasn't in the class the next week either. The rumors started to spread pretty fast in the school. Someone claimed that they actually saw police at Mr. Jackson's home, and then they tried to determine why. Then, many students started talking about how Mr. Jackson was pretty creepy or something about him was off. Then there were rumors that some students came forward with certain claims. And then the local news and letters sent home to our parents confirmed that this wasn't a rumor, but the truth. The rest of this was information that I either got from the news, my parents, or people around the school. He was charged with multiple things and went to prison that I knew. But then I learned that when the girl was confronted, she told her parents and authorities what happened, and multiple other girls came forward with claims as well. They also mentioned that there were multiple tapes found with not only similar things to what I saw, but others where he seemed to stalk the girls. I was also friends with a guy whose sister actually came forward, which made me feel like all the other claims were true too. I mean, there was physical proof of one, and he was brave enough to keep it at school, so I absolutely believe that there would be more than just one of them. The first girl that I saw in the video stopped going to our school, and I learned that she was homeschooled. Sometimes, I wanted to stop by her home to see how she was doing, but I didn't want to worry her or her family when a strange guy showed up. Obviously, this has been many years ago and we've all since graduated. I don't know whatever happened to the girl, and I don't think that she even knew that I may have been the one that put the whole thing in motion. But I really hope she's doing okay. So, I know it wasn't exactly me that was affected, but it was still pretty terrifying to see, not to mention knowing that I had to have had some impact in changing some people's lives. Who knows how long he may have continued with his horrible acts if I would have kept that to myself. I wanted to share an event that happened to me and my granddaughter at the last place that I lived in. My husband died in a car accident when my daughter was pregnant, so I never got to meet her. But also being an empty nester, I didn't feel right living in our big 4-bedroom home alone, and I decided that it was time to downsize. I found a cute little condominium that was only about 20 minutes from my daughter and son-in-law, and it was a good price, so I moved right in. The only thing about it, however, was that it definitely needed a more homely and me touch to it. So, while I made some changes inside with the help of my kids, I also wanted to start up another garden like I had at my old home. My kids helped me put it together when they were younger, which made it all the more special to me. And now, my first granddaughter was now at the age they were, and I wanted to have her help with it if she wanted to. Maggie is like a little mini-me. I helped my daughter and son-in-law take care of her when she was born. I watched her a lot so they could sleep or even just get out for a bit alone. And she loved staying over with me too. So when I brought up the garden, she was more than willing to help, and my daughter loved the idea. At the time of this event, I was 49 and my granddaughter was 8. She came over with some stuff that they had bought, including a small gardening kit, a sun hat, a mat, all of the stuff that she needed. My son-in-law helped me with lining and digging the top part of the dirt, since it was pretty hard, and then we did most of the rest. On the day Maggie and I were out back, deciding what we wanted to plant and where, my neighbor Howard had come out back and greeted us. The fences weren't very tall. It came up to about my chest and seemed to more just be to separate the property rather than for privacy. But I didn't mind Howard. I think he was close to my age, maybe a year or two younger, but he seemed like a nice guy. He introduced himself when I moved in and even helped my son-in-law fix one of my windows. He stopped and asked what we were up to, and then we started talking about the garden for a bit. I noticed he kept looking down at Maggie, and I realized that he hadn't met her yet, so I introduced them, explaining that she was my granddaughter. So we talked about her for a while, and then we continued on with our plans for the day. Now, Howard also had a small dog, I think a corgi, and there were a few kids in the neighborhood that liked to go over to his place to play with the dog, or I've even seen some kids walking the dog, so he was definitely not unknown to the community and never gave off any weird feelings. In fact, the way he talked to me was very kind and playful in a way when he asked if I was single. I honestly thought that he may have even been flirting with me. It had been some time since my husband has passed away, so I didn't dislike the attention either. I started catching Howard outside on multiple occasions when Maggie and I were out there, and we'd start chatting for a while we worked. The conversations were always friendly and innocent, and we all had a good time. Maggie even offered him some lemonade when we were taking a break. I didn't start to notice something was off until a little further into our garden work. Howard was starting to show up every time we were out there, and it was fine at first. But he would start talking to Maggie, distracting her, which caused her to knock some things over before as well. There were also a few times where Maggie wasn't with me, and I had gone out back to mow or do weed, and he would show up again. The conversation at that point, though, would be brief. It was a quick "how's it going?" Then he would ask me about Maggie, and when I would mention that she wasn't with me, the conversation would end pretty quickly, and he would leave. I started catching on to this, and I wasn't really a fan of it. I felt bad because I started limiting how much Maggie would do. We didn't have much left, but we were planting the last of the seeds when he came over. That's when I instructed Maggie to go inside and then clean up. I could see his attention shift to her as she walked in, and our conversation became pretty dull, and he eventually walked off. This happened a few times, and I don't know if he caught on to what I was doing or if he just gave up, but he started coming around less and less. There was 1 week that Maggie was going to be staying with me, and she was enjoying the sprinkler that I had set up to water the garden. So I bought something similar to set up for her to play in. While she was changing into her swimsuit, I went out front to get the mail. On my way, I saw my neighbor across the way was out there, and we had begun talking about random things. At one point, I turned back to look at my condo when I saw Howard walking back from his driveway and into his house. And my first thought was, great, he's going to ruin something that I had planned for Maggie. I knew she was still inside waiting for me though, so I finished my conversation with my neighbor, and then I started walking back towards my door. I don't know what it was or how to explain it, but I felt the need to walk over to Howard's side and see if he was outside. While we had the wall-like fences out back, they went as far as the condo. The front of them either had a small half-brick wall or nothing separating them, so I could easily walk over on his side of my property. I could hear him laughing, so I knew he was out back. This immediately made me feel uncomfortable because I had a feeling that Maggie was probably already out back as well, even though I told her to wait for me. Kids are still kids, you know, and she was excited. So, even though I shouldn't have, I went to open his gate, and to my disgust, I saw him standing at the fence, looking into my yard with his pants down. I immediately yelled at him, none of which were nice words or words Maggie probably ever heard me say, but it was enough to make him stumble and trip as he tried to pick his pants up and then go inside. I immediately ran into my home to find Maggie out back, looking around confused. I asked her what she was doing, and she explained that she was trying to bring the sprinkler outside for me to help when Howard showed up. While she was grabbing the hose, he told her how to hold it up in the air to make it look like it was raining, to which she did. I was disgusted, and I was trying to keep calm in front of Maggie. She could already tell something was wrong by the way she was talking to me. Unfortunately, I had to lie to her and tell her that we couldn't play in the sprinkler because it was going to storm, and instead, I suggested that we make homemade popsicles inside, which seemed to cheer her up. While she was getting started, I called the police and the leasing office to tell them what I just witnessed. The police came over and took down the information. However, they said they couldn't do much since he was on his own property, and I had opened the gate, but they said that if it happened again and anyone else witnessed it, to call them back so they can try to get him for indecent exposure. The leasing office apologized and said that they would talk to him, but said that they couldn't keep him from being in his backyard. It was like they missed the entire point. He was invading my space by looking over and doing what he was doing. So I asked them if I could put up a taller privacy fence, and they refused. They said that it had to stay uniform and there would be too many steps to try and get the people or businesses that actually own the place to pay for the changes. That told me that they weren't even willing to try. I had just moved into this place a few months ago, and now I no longer felt safe there, or at least didn't feel safe having my granddaughter there. I told my daughter and son-in-law about the incidents too. They too were torn. None of us wanted this guy anywhere near Maggie, and it broke my heart. I know Maggie was upset about it, but when she came over, she wasn't allowed to go out back, and she could only go out front if someone was with her. I didn't even like her staying the night, so if anything, I stayed the night with them when they needed a babysitter. Howard didn't even try to show his face around after that. And it wasn't even just around me. People saw the cops at my home that day, and I wasn't going to keep that information to myself. I told anyone and everyone I could about him, and just from word of mouth, he was shunned pretty hard. The other kids were not allowed to be around him, and when he went out front, you could see the other parents or grandparents pulling their kids to the other side of them. It must have gotten to him because within that same year, he moved out. I saw moving trucks and I couldn't be more relieved. And once he was gone, I let Maggie stay the night, have friends over, and even play out back and enjoy the hard work that she put into that garden with me. I lived there for a few years, but over time, I learned the leasing people were not as nice as they appeared to be when I moved in, and they were not giving me any reason to make me reconsider. But now, I live in a small house with my own yard and a privacy fence, and I will never let something like that happen ever again, because next time, Grandma might have to use something other than her words. Last May, a few of my friends and I decided to have a birthday celebration for one of our friends that was turning 19. Her birthday was on Friday the 13th, so she wanted to do a sort of Halloween theme with all of us in costumes and then go to a local bar. So, we got all dressed up, some of us in a little more sexier looking costume, and some of us in some dumb costumes. So there was a total of 5 of us. The birthday girl, Mandy, was a witch. Angel, dressed as an angel. I was a zombie. And Cassie and Leila were ketchup and mustard bottles. We all met at Mandy's house and started with a few shots. Cassie didn't really drink, so she was our designated driver that night. And after we had our liquid confidence, we headed out to the bar, no longer fearing what people would think of us being in fall costumes in the middle of May. When we got there, it was actually quite the opposite of what we expected. Some of the patrons took pictures and asked us what the occasion was, and even bought us some drinks, so we were genuinely having a good time there. However, at one point, there was a group of guys that came in. 3 of them. It was one of those moments where they opened the squeaking door, so we all looked and then continued dancing and laughing. As with everyone else that was there, they were staring at us off and on until they finally approached us. They made some cheesy comments about the angel costume and then asked us why we were dressed up, so we again explained that it was for a birthday. They wished her a happy birthday and then bought us all drinks as well. We thought that would be the end of it, but they seemed to linger around, just watching us. None of us were really giving them any attention. Cassie and Layla were dating, and I had a boyfriend, and Mandy and Angel were just doing their own thing and having fun. So, there definitely weren't any signals telling them that they were welcome to stay and hang out with us. However, it was a bar, and no one reserved anything, so they had every right to be over by us too. We were in a smaller section in the back by the dartboard and pool table. And after a while, we all noticed that they would lean in and say something and then look over at us and nod or point. I think we all anticipated what they may have wanted, and we really weren't interested in picking up a date, so we decided to leave and then find another bar. But as we were walking out, one of the guys hollered out asking where we were going, and I said home. We found another bar that wasn't too far from the first one, and we went in to continue our fun. However, those same three guys came strolling in not long after us. We all looked at each other, making sure that we weren't crazy, and tried to pretend like we didn't see them. This time, we sat at one of the back tables and decided to order something to eat so we weren't just running on alcohol. But it was only a matter of time that these guys would finally come over, and of course, one of them sat in a chair next to me, and one sat on the other side next to Angel, and one continued standing. They asked us how old we were, and we were hoping if we were honest that they would just leave us alone, knowing that we were still pretty young. But instead, they seemed pretty happy with this idea. They made comments on how good we all looked and offered to buy us more drinks while slipping in the comment about how we must still want some since we lied about going home. I then said something about wanting to get something to eat before going home, which is why we ended up at that bar. But ultimately, we all declined the drinks, now no longer feeling comfortable around them. We ordered a plate of nachos to share, but when it arrived, no one immediately touched them due to the awkwardness of the air. So the guy closest to me pulled them closer and started eating them. And as they were devouring our nachos, they started laughing and talking about themselves, and we didn't know what to do about it. We just sat there looking at each other while occasionally giggling when they said something and laughed. At one point, I had taken out my cell phone and I was texting my boyfriend to let him know what was happening with my left hand, which wasn't exactly easy for me to begin with. However, the guy must have noticed and was obviously mad about it. I could tell by the way he slammed his hand down on the table, and then he said, "Hey, no phones out on the table." And after looking at me angrily, he then started laughing, and so did the other two. To say that I was freaking out would be an understatement. I don't know what their plans were, but I was too afraid to get up and leave, but even more terrified of what might happen if I stayed there. Thankfully, Cassie stood up and started walking away when the guy again said in his booming voice, "Hey, where are you going?" And without flinching, without a stutter or a hint of fear, she said, "To the bathroom." And she kept walking. I only hoped that she had a plan and waited for her to return. It probably felt a lot longer than it actually was, but she finally came back and without acknowledging them, told us that we should go. We all nodded in agreement, but we were all waiting to see who the first person to stand up would be. And that's when Angel shot up real quick and walked towards Cassie. The guys then tried inviting us back to their place for more free drinks, as if they hadn't already terrified the hell out of us. We all declined and finally got the courage to stand up and started walking towards the front of the bar. And of course, they were following right behind us as if they were part of our party. That's when we noticed Cassie's whole plan coming together. At the front of the bar was her dad, in full police uniform, greeting us with open arms. He apologized for being late and then immediately followed up with, "Those guys with you?" We all looked back and noticed that they were just standing around, trying not to make eye contact with us. He then followed us outside and we were all thanking Cassie for her quick thinking and for him showing up to save us. Her dad has always been such a gentle giant, but not that you could tell just by looking at him. So I felt relieved that those guys seemed to be pretty intimidated by him, or at least the uniform. He followed us back to Mandy's place and made sure no one else followed either. And thankfully, we never saw or heard from them again. We finished our night inside watching dumb horror movies on Netflix and eating all of our snack foods, so we didn't let it ruin our night. We're a lot more careful now when we go out to places like that, and I now have an emergency text set up so I can send it quickly. I, a 20-year-old female, was in a new city, trying to navigate back to my hotel. It was beginning to get dark outside, so I started getting anxious and I picked up my pace, even though I was on a main road and there was still lots of people around me. In my rush though, I turned down the wrong road. After a very short amount of time, I noticed that the road looked pretty empty and it was definitely darker further down. It gave me the creeps, which made me realize that I turned down the wrong road, so I turned around to go back to the main road. That's when I noticed that some guy was walking close behind me. I'm not exactly sure how to explain how close he was. Not so close that he was in my personal place, but he was close enough for me to freak out. He looked creepy too. He was wearing a black sweater with a hood pulled up, and his hands were kept in his hoodie's front pocket, and it looked like he might have been holding something too. I only got a glimpse of the front of him because right after I turned around, he quickly turned around too and then speed walked away from me, back onto the main road, and then vanished around a corner. I don't know if he was stalking me, but it was weird as hell. Why did he turn around right after I turned around? And why did he walk away like that? Did he suddenly realize that he also went down the wrong road? Hi everyone, I work for Gloria Jeans. It's a coffee place here in Australia that sounds a lot like Starbucks. That being said, I've never actually been to a Starbucks. Anyway, the chain is fairly popular around Australia. I've worked here for about 2 years now, and I started when I went to university studying women's studies. I'm still working at Gloria Jeans because the cost of living in Australia is so damn expensive, so I need it as a side job. Basically, I need this job to help me stay afloat. I was serving in the morning rush of people who were waiting with various degrees of patience for their morning coffee, when I noticed a woman that I hadn't seen before. I asked her for her order, and to be honest, I don't remember what it was or her name. It's hard to remember it all, you know. The morning rush was over, and she was still there. There was nothing weird about her, and she didn't give us any trouble like our Karen or Darren characters would. I asked her if she was okay, and she asked me how I was doing. I said I was fine, just the morning rush can be a little bit intense. She asked if she could ask me a few questions, and since it was quiet, and management likes it when we have good rapport with our customers, I agreed with her. She asked if I had a partner, and I said no, not at that moment. I swear, her face lit up. So far, nothing was super weird except that. I apologized to her, and I told her that I wasn't looking for anybody, but she didn't look fazed at all. Each day afterward, she showed up and wanted to speak with me. It was really getting annoying. She would wait there all day and follow me when I had my time off work. I told her that I was on a break and I needed space to eat and rest. She sat at the table across from me, staring and eating her food. She hadn't done anything violent, just being really weird, you know? I asked her to be left alone, and she sulked and got up and left. But she was back again the next day. I talked to my manager about it, and he didn't take it seriously. One day, I had to take my car into the repair shop to get it fixed, so I had to catch the bus instead. I hate taking public transport, but it was either that or an Uber, and I wanted to save up some cash. Anyway, she was on the same bus, and then she got off at my stop. I had to sneak through different apartment blocks to hide from her, so she wouldn't know where I lived. I told my manager what happened, and finally, he asked her to leave the store. I tried ignoring her. One day, I had to work late and I was walking out to where I parked my car. Two things were wrong. She was sitting on my car, and she was waiting for me. I said, "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" And she said that she had been waiting for me and that she had missed me. I told her to leave me alone and I drove home. Well, this was where I made a big mistake. I didn't realize that she put an AirTag on my car and then found out my address. Over the next couple of months, I was sure someone was looking through my windows. One of my plants was also stolen. I'm not sure if it was her or not. And I noticed strange little bottles on my front step. It was incredibly strange. I didn't see her at my house until I realized that I forgot to take the bins out, so I did that. I came back inside, I closed and I locked the door. And then, I came back to see her sitting in my living room. I let out a scream when I saw her and the maniacal grin on her face. She told me that she had been waiting so long for this. So I ran to my phone and I called the cops while she tried to take the phone from me, screaming at the top of her lungs that she loved me and that I was hers. I was backed up into the kitchen when she grabbed one of the knives, threatening me with it, and I punched her to get her away from me. That crazy bitch started slicing into her own arms. It was the most insane thing that I have ever seen in my life. My neighbors heard the screaming, and the police and the ambulance came to take her away. She had lost a lot of blood, and surprisingly, the cops got her to drop the knife. I don't know what I would have done if they were forced to kill her in my home. She was arrested, and I think she was sent to a mental health facility. I do hope she's okay, but I'm just happy to be done with it. So I have a story about a guy that I met on the internet that ended up being, well, I think creep is probably an understatement, but it's the best word that I can think of to define him. I'm sure that some people out there have more appropriate choice adjectives for him, but creep works for me. Anyways, this was a good number of years ago. I was pretty active on social media platforms that doesn't exist anymore. I had garnered a decent following by posting stupid pop culture memes and references. Pretty shallow, I know, but it was fun, and I was like 16 at that time, and I liked the friendships that I was making, mostly because I didn't have many friends in real life. Most of the people that hung around my page were pretty decent, honestly, and I rarely had to block anyone or report anyone. One day, I got a message from someone that had followed me, saying that they enjoyed my page and that they thought that I was a pretty cool person. Obviously, they hadn't met me, and I didn't put much in ways of personal information out on the page. But again, I was young, and that kind of validation was something that I wanted. They seemed pretty normal at first, just telling me that they liked my content and about how much they liked the show or that band. It was a pretty normal conversation for the most part, and then they followed up with a pretty common ASL, which for those that don't know means age, sex, and location, asking for information about me. I told them that I was 16 and female, but then said that I didn't really want to give out my location. The other person said they were 19, male, and that they lived in the same state that I actually lived in. Obviously, he didn't know that, but I was a bit irked to see that he did live in the same state. He didn't push me at all to tell him where I lived, so although I was a bit, I said irked earlier, but I don't know if that's the word, I still tried to talk to him because he didn't know that I lived in the same state as him. We talked every once in a while, just chatting about whatever, mostly him telling me about the movies and things that he liked. But then, out of seemingly nowhere, he started hounding me and asking me for more information on who I was and telling me that he loved me. I told him that he was being a creep, and if he didn't stop, I was going to have to block him. Then, he threw out, Go ahead and block me, Caitlin, if it will make you feel better about yourself." I was sufficiently freaked out because I'd never told him my name, and there was no indication that my name was Caitlin on my page. So, I immediately blocked him. The fact that he knew my name told me that he had somehow gotten information on me, and I wasn't going to risk him being a creep even more than he had already. But, of course, if that was the end of it, this would be a rather boring story. And this was certainly not the end of it. I thought that he was going to go away after being blocked, but he was just getting started with me apparently. The next day, I got a direct message from an account that had literally no information associated with it. To the best of my knowledge, this site required information like a name and such, but the name was blank, the picture was plain white, and the description on the account was, "Not done with you yet." I knew right away who it was going to be, and I wasn't surprised when I saw that the message was, "I have something for you." I stupidly said, "What do you want?" And he responded with an incredibly inappropriate image. I won't describe it, but one can guess what it was. I blocked his account too, but it didn't matter. Every other day, he was messaging me with gory images, naked pictures of himself, and other various disgusting images. It hit a point where I ended up logging off my account entirely and just basically forgetting it existed. For about 2 weeks, this was sufficient enough to stop him from being able to harass me. Until I checked my email one day and saw a message from an email address that was just random characters. And sure enough, when I clicked that message, I knew it was him. The message was a picture of me from the prior year's school yearbook. It had my first and last name, my home address, my school address, and another very disgusting photo of a part of his body. This was where I knew I had to end this. I needed to get someone else involved. I ended up bringing it up to my mom. I was a bit slow with explaining it. But after a while, I basically just put it out there that this guy now knew where I lived, went to school, and had my full name in my picture. I showed her the email, and she told me that we needed to tell my dad, and that he said that we needed to take it to the police. Thankfully, the police did take it very seriously because this was a fairly credible threat, and he was sending adult content to a minor. We ended up making the report, and my parents basically told me that I wasn't allowed to use the computer anymore, and they informed my school of the situation too. That way, if someone was found around the school, or if anyone came up for me, they would know that it could be this guy. Even worse, that's exactly what happened, and how this all ended. It was about 2 weeks later, and there was an announcement over the intercom that the school was going on lockdown and that all students needed to remain in the classrooms. We were all a bit curious and scared. This was the early 2000s, so it wasn't a common thing to have to go through these kinds of things. After several hours, they announced that the lockdown was over, and then my teacher got a call and then they asked me to come to the office. When I got there, my parents were there, and I had to sit with them, the administration, and also the police to discuss my situation. Apparently, this guy had come into my school and told the front office that he was my uncle, Ronald, which was my uncle's name, and he was an emergency contact for me, and that he was there to come get me out of class for the day because I had a doctor's appointment. Thankfully, the front desk knew my uncle and had his picture on file on the computer, and this guy was not him. Plus, they knew that there was a potential threat with this rando, and they asked him to wait in the lobby while they called me down. They then called the school resource officer and immediately cuffed this guy. A fun fact about this creep, he was in his mid-40s, not like 19 like he said, and he didn't actually live in the state. He was from Texas. I know I didn't mention where I live, but it was nowhere near Texas. Which meant that he already knew where I lived when he asked, and that's why he said that he lived in my state. I have no idea what this guy's intentions were, though I can kind of make some incredibly disturbing assumptions. But I'm glad that I ended up talking to my parents about it. I was banned from the computer for something like 2 years at my house, and I was fine with that. It was nice having the validation of strangers, but it clearly came at the cost of my own safety and security, and that was absolutely not worth it. In the end, he went down for a number of things, including for the content he had on his hard drive, and I don't think he's going to be getting out of prison, like, ever. I'm thankful for that, because I never want to meet him, ever, again. So me, an 18-year-old female, and my boyfriend Jordan went to Walmart for some quarantine shopping. You know, stuff to keep ourselves entertained, some basic health supplies, and most importantly, aromatherapy materials for me. Something important to this shopping trip is that I have extremely high anxiety and a bit of a paranoia disorder from abuse that I suffered as a child. This is important to note for 2 reasons. 1, it's the reason that I went to the candle section in the first place, as I use aromatherapy to help with my anxiety. And 2, with my paranoia, I often downplay dangerous situations in my head because I make myself think that I'm overreacting when I'm not. Now, on with the story. As Jordan and I were walking through Walmart, I thought I noticed a guy trailing us. I thought nothing of it and chopped it up to me being paranoid and decided not to tell Jordan, which I would later regret. Despite my internal decision that I was just being paranoid, I decided to test my theory and told Jordan that I wanted to go look at the stickers. We went into the sticker aisle and the guy walked past us, looking at us as he did. After the guy was out of sight, I broke down crying, but I didn't want to alarm Jordan, so I told him that the virus was just really stressing me out. Jordan calmed me down and we went on our way to the candles. As I was looking for my different scents that I would need to help myself get through the quarantine, Jordan decided to go look at some hardware nearby for some projects that he was going to work on during his quarantine too. We didn't quarantine together. I thought nothing of it, and I decided that I would just stay by the candles until he got back because I can be a bit of a wanderer and I didn't want to cause more stress than necessary. But not more than 10 seconds after Jordan walked away, I felt a pair of eyes on me. Something in my gut told me that it was the same guy from before, but I was too scared to turn around and check for myself. I stood there frozen in panic for about 30 seconds when I hear footsteps approaching from directly behind me. They come towards me, stop for a moment, and I then hear them walking away. And then they turn around and I hear them approaching me once more and then stopping a few feet behind me. This entire time, I can't see who is behind me because I'm just paralyzed with fear. But after about 2 minutes, Jordan finally comes back up and gently wraps one arm around my waist, giving me a knowing look. We decided that we were done with shopping, even though we didn't have everything that we needed. We checked out and then went home. Later, Jordan told me that he had noticed the guy following us earlier, and he watched the guy standing about 5 to 6 feet behind me as I was looking at the candles, just staring at me. The guy then walked closer to me, noticed Jordan looking at him, and changed course to look like he was going to a different aisle. Then when he thought that Jordan had left, he walked even closer to me, standing about 4 feet behind me, again staring. That's when Jordan decided that this guy was up to something and then came back by me. I am so thankful that I had Jordan there with me, because who knows what could have happened if he wasn't there. This is a story that pops back up in my mind from time to time. I've told it to a few people, but I definitely feel like it deserves its place in here. It's for sure one of the scariest moments that I have ever had as a child. Back when I was around 10 years old, my mom finally decided that it was time for her to start taking her driver's license. When she began taking lessons, she was struggling a lot. For that reason, my dad decided that he wanted to do some practice with her besides the official driving lessons with her instructor, just to make sure that she would pass the upcoming test first try. My little brother and I were attending swimming lessons at this nearby university at that time. Behind a forested area near the university lays this huge student parking area surrounded by trees, which turned out to be basically empty every weekend. My dad saw the opportunity to take my mom here to drive around for a bit and practice, and brought my little brother and I with them since we were too young to stay home alone. So we brought a football with us. When we arrived to the parking lot later on in the evening, my parents began their practice. My little brother and I quickly got bored though, so we asked if we could go over to this little grass field on the side of the parking lot to play some football. My parents let us, since they'd always be able to keep their eyes on us while driving around. And after playing for some time, my parents ended up driving around in the other end of the parking lot. They were approximately 300 to 400 meters away from my brother and I. But suddenly, this white Toyota pulls into the parking lot. We were playing almost right at the exit or entrance. The car turns around and then stops on my right side with a vehicle facing the exit. The driver rolls down his windows and presents himself as Thomas. He looked friendly, he was good looking, and he was also young. I guess maybe around 30. Well, this is where things started to get weird. On the passenger seat was a woman covering her face with a newspaper. All I could see was long blonde hair, and on the back seat was a baby sat in a baby chair. Thomas immediately states that he is from the police and that we have to get in the car immediately as he has to talk to us. My brother actually took 2 steps towards the vehicle, But I stuck my arm in front of his chest as I was sensing that something was really off about this. The woman was still covering her face at this point, not saying a word. Thomas then raised his voice and then told us once again to get in the car, or else he'd had to come out and get us. My brother and I froze out of fear. Suddenly, the woman put the newspaper down, showed her face and told us in the most calm motherly voice to just listen to the man, okay? The woman looked young and pretty, like a person who wouldn't hurt a fly. But at this moment, I began screaming as loud as I could. What we hadn't seen at that point was that my dad was already running as fast as he could towards us. He was coming from behind the vehicle, so we didn't see it. My parents didn't have time to drive to us since the road down the parking lot was twisted all the way. When my dad heard my scream, he started yelling as loud as he could, saying, "Hey, who the fuck are you? Get the fuck away from my children!" And as soon as Thomas heard my dad and realized that my brother and I weren't alone, he threw his car into gear and took off as fast as he could. He most definitely looked like a person who shat himself when he saw my dad. My dad was furious and told my brother and I to hurry back to the car. He didn't even think about calling the police at that point. He just wanted to beat up that guy himself. That resulted in us driving around for the next hour, trying to find him before my dad cooled down and decided that he should probably just call the police. We never found out who these people were. But this episode taught me to never judge a book by its cover. People can be the most friendly-looking people in the world and still wish evil upon you or the ones that you love. I'm not sure what these people would have done to us, but I am sure about one thing though. They definitely weren't from the police. A couple of years ago, my boyfriend planned a surprise birthday party for me, and I was sufficiently surprised by it. It was also where this story of mine took place. Well, to go back a little bit first, my boyfriend and I have been together since high school. After we graduated, we started attending different colleges, and he was a few hours away, so he was staying in the dorms. I was attending a local community college, so I found an apartment within my budget with the plans of my boyfriend moving in when he was done. College was fine for the most part. It seemed like the normal school stuff. I met some new friends, had some from high school attending there too. The schoolwork and the teachers were fine as well. But there was one guy that I could never really get away from though. That was Ricky. Ricky was in the same program as me, so I saw him a lot. One of the classes had a project that we had to work on in groups, and I was paired with Ricky and another girl named Micah. Micah was pretty cool though. She was typically more reserved, but she was kind and very smart. I was happy to be on her team, really. Then Ricky, he seemed like he was trying to show off since he was teamed up with two girls. He would talk about things he's done, like stunts or past jobs, that all seemed to end the same way. He would say that the atmosphere changed, or he didn't really like the new management, so he would quit. I could tell Micah couldn't care less and just wanted to talk more about the project, and I was a little more willing to cut him off, which is what I did. I would steer the conversation back towards our work. This is probably where my view of Ricky really started to shift. While working on the project, he started rambling about something, and Micah spoke up and said, "Can you please stop talking about yourself for one session?" I kind of chuckled and made a comment about making the quiet girl tell him off. I guess he realized he was outnumbered, so he just got up and left the room. We continued working and got the most done we had compared to the last sessions. Ricky then ended up catching me in the parking lot later after that class and stopped to talk to me. I wasn't rude or anything. I just treated him like I would anyone else. He asked me a few questions about the project, and then when the conversation seemed to die down, I started saying something about needing to go when he interjected and said, you want to go make out in my car? With the most serious look on his face. Not knowing how else to react, I just started laughing, and his face didn't change. So I stopped laughing and asked if he was serious, but he didn't respond, so I just said no thanks and that I had a boyfriend. And then he laughed and said, "Oh, okay, cool," before waving and walking off to get in his car. I just stood there, confused for a quick second, and I then went and got in my car and immediately called my boyfriend to tell him what had happened. The whole time laughing about the awkwardness of that moment. My boyfriend laughed too and thought that it was weird, but then asked if he had ever done that before or tried flirting with me or someone else, and I told him not that I was aware of. He said the guy just seemed awkward, but to be careful because you never know, and I agreed with him. So the next class was pretty weird. I tried not making eye contact with him while we worked, but I could tell the whole time that he was just staring at me with a stupid grin on his face. It was obvious Micah noticed this too, probably made it more obvious when in the middle of working, he again said, "You sure you don't want to make out?" Micah looked just as embarrassed as myself, and I again told him no. The session ended pretty soon after that. However, this did not deter Ricky. Anytime that I saw him, he would ask that, whether it was in the parking lot, in the school, even if he was around other people. I told my boyfriend each time who started to become more concerned and suggested that I tell someone at school, which I did. However, all they said was that they would have a talk with him, and that's it. So, he stopped being so verbal about his advances, but instead, he decided that he would wink, make some kissy faces at me, or make other suggestive hand motions at me. And now, I was really starting to get creeped out. Thankfully, the teacher was actually understanding and said Micah and I could continue working without him, since we were doing all of the work anyways. And the teacher even gave us permission to work in the teacher's area if we needed a place to get away from him. But it seemed like the less that I saw him, the more aggressive he would become. I saw him one time in the parking lot and tried to guilt trip me about the project. I told him that he needed to talk to the teacher about it as it wasn't our choice, and he made another suggestive remark. I told him he was disgusting and being really creepy, and I quickly left as he stood in the parking lot with that same stupid grin. The last event I mentioned happened the week before my birthday, and between that and Ricky making me feel gross, I decided to cut classes the following week. I got most of my assignments from my teachers ahead of time, which was really nice. That way, I didn't have to be behind, and I told Micah so we could schedule time outside of class to meet up. My boyfriend was going to be doing the same and driving up to stay with me for the week, so I was pretty excited, and I didn't want anything to ruin our week. My boyfriend, Adrian, showed up within the next day or two, and we had a nice day together. Adrian said he wanted to take me somewhere specifically for my birthday, so he suggested that I get my oil changed. I had a better car, so we usually drove mine when he came up. He also encouraged me to go meet up with Micah that day in case I didn't feel up to it after my birthday celebrations. I was talking about the adult things that I wanted to get out of the way so we had more time to spend together. So this was a load off, knowing that he was okay with me doing this all on the same day. So he sent me off with a hug and a kiss, and he stayed at my apartment and said that he might go visit with his parents. So the day went fine, and about the time that I was finishing up with Micah, I texted Adrian, and he even told me that I could invite Micah back and we could all go have dinner or something. I thought that it was convenient because she had asked me if I wanted to grab something to eat anyways, so we headed back to my apartment. Then, neither of us were expecting to have people scream surprise as I opened the door. This man had this whole party planned out, and I, none the wiser, thought that he was just being nice and having me do all this stuff. Anyways, the party was great. There were probably about 15 or 20 people there, including both of our parents and friends. And when we did the cake, Adrian was teasing me about something, and I ended up putting cake on his face. This started him trying to wipe it on me, while others around us were taking pictures and laughing too. It was legitimately a great time for me. But shortly after this though, while I was wiping my face off, Micah came over to me and softly asked if I invited Ricky or if my boyfriend was friends with him by chance. I was at first confused by this because she knew how creepy he was being, and even if I knew about this party, I sure as hell would not have invited him. She motioned towards the living room, and I rushed in there to see him helping himself to the food on my table. I had so many things circling in my head. The people here were all pretty close friends, including only 2 from the college that I had met. So the people that were here were invited either by text or a Facebook message. I had no idea how he found out about the party, and even more concerning, how he knew where I lived. I didn't want to cause a scene, and to be honest, I didn't know how he would react, so I just said his name. He looked up at me and said something along the lines of, "Oh, haha, there's the tease." I asked him what he was doing here, and then just bluntly said that he wasn't welcome here, and he started going off, saying some pretty nasty things about me. I was scared, I was angry, and I was embarrassed since our parents were there. Adrian had gone to the restroom to clean up, so he walked out while this was happening and tried asking what was going on, but I think he figured it out pretty quickly. He started approaching Ricky, telling him that he needed to leave now before we called the cops, and his face lit up. He really said, "Oh, is this the guy you've been cheating on me with?" Then, he tried making these crazy accusations of us. Not only were they completely false, but I could feel myself getting red as my parents and his parents were looking like they were getting uncomfortable. Adrian started getting a bit more aggressive towards him and pushing him towards the door, and my dad also started walking towards the door too. Ricky tried to give one last hurrah, saying he would fight Adrian for me, and then pulled out a knife. I was terrified at this point, and there were a few of us shouting, but thankfully, nothing else happened. My dad used to be a security guard, so he managed to do something to make him drop the knife, and Adrian helped knock him to the ground. They had him restrained pretty well, and I went to grab my cell phone to call the cops. The whole time, Ricky is still going on and on about things he has done to me and wants to do to me, to the point that Adrian ended up hitting him in the head pretty hard. It didn't knock him out though, and he just laughed. That felt like forever, but the police finally arrived and arrested him. And after they left, we tried to pull the party back together, which was pretty rough for me. I had locked myself in my bedroom for a bit because, I was pretty embarrassed, mostly by the things he was saying. They were all false, but the fact that he said all of that in front of people and in so much detail was horrible. He had to have thought all of that out, like fantasized it, which still grosses me out thinking about it. And I eventually came out after my mom and Adrian came and talked to me and also convinced me that everyone else was back to having fun. Overall, this made me file a restraining order. I told the school about it, and they seemed to reluctantly make changes so that I didn't have to see him anymore. I had a few online classes, and I'm sure that they changed things for him because we were never on campus on the same day it seemed. However, he did try to press charges on Adrian, but nothing happened with that, thankfully. Like, he dropped the charges or something because he got papers saying that it was dropped or dismissed. I don't really remember. But yeah, that was probably one of the most memorable birthdays that I ever had, and I hope that I never see Ricky again. I'm using a throwaway account, so if my stalker is reading this, he doesn't get insights into my current life from the usual Reddit activity. Yeah, I'm that paranoid. It's a very long story, but I feel like I'm doing myself a disservice if I don't write things out from the beginning. I've wanted to write about this for a long time now. It's such a nuisance of a situation, and it seems like any time that I find a semblance of mental peace, this piece of shit comes out of the woodwork to make sure that I still remember he's out there. This guy, let's call him Marvin, was in my circle of friends for a bit in high school and my early college years, late 2000s and onwards. He dated a good friend of mine, Alice, and we'd hung out both with her and with other friends too. We would sometimes smoke weed together and etc., but he and I weren't very close at all. He had some odd sense of humor, but I was kinda oblivious to the darker aspects of his personality till he cheated on my friend at a party. Well, according to his close friends, and then he lied about it. I was protective of my friends, and while I never interfered in their relationships, when my friend asked my input about it, I told her she deserved better than to be lied to. To be clear, even his friend said this to her, but she continued seeing him as a friend with benefits. We even hung out together in groups, but she mentioned to me many times that he's manipulative. Besides the cheating incident, she told me other instances of him acting callously. Once, when he was walking with Alice and her best friend, who he didn't like because he thought she was ugly, they dropped off Alice, and instead of walking her friend home, he just ditched her without saying anything. It was dark out. My friend also told me that the first time that they had sex, well, she didn't recognize it as assault at that time. Looking back, she realized he has raped her. He was very forceful and hurtful, and she didn't realize that was wrong because she was infatuated with him. He had a tendency to make silly homoerotic jokes, and this wasn't uncommon with guys that I knew at that time. He had gay friends and didn't have an issue with them publicly. But I remember once that this gay kid had a crush on him and was sending flirtatious comments on MySpace. Instead of just telling him that he's not interested or not actually gay, he flips out on him. He calls him a slur and viciously insults him in a tirade on his MySpace comment. Things started to get a little messier around 2010 to 2011. One day, Marvin gets into a car accident with his mom. His mom had some minor injuries. Alice had a great relationship with her, so she visited them. I don't know the full context, but something about the way the interaction went triggered Alice to tell Marvin that she thinks he's a sociopath. Probably the worst thing she could have done, but alas, out of my control. He's a good-looking guy and very fit guy, and definitely had some obvious narcissistic traits, But I'd never really learned much about sociopaths beside watching Dexter. So when she told me and the other friends about what she deduced, it was both eye-opening and a little freaky. We briefly worked together at a retail store, and I saw him getting close to the younger brother of a friend of mine from school who worked with us. He was a chubby kid with low self-esteem, and he admired Marvin's fitness and confidence. Marvin started working out with him, and this kid would always talk about how awesome Marvin is. But instead of just minding my business, I felt compelled to interject, and I messaged him one day just telling him to be careful about letting Marvin get too close, as he can be a bit manipulative. This is among the biggest regrets of my life. Of course, he tells his idol what I said, and while we remained cordial, clearly he knew what went down. He eventually leaves the job and goes into hiding after working a scheme to steal big-ticket items with the help from several team members, including my friend's brother. Another time, Marvin and I were smoking weed at the house of an old friend of mine. My friend, let's call her Diana, was a very trusting person and an incredible host. I was high out of my mind, and Marvin was kinda being highly complimentary of my friend who hosted us. Again, my stupid, nosy protective instincts kick in, and I grin and comment something like, I know what you're doing. He was probably just earnestly making connections, and I assumed that he must have manipulative intent based on what his girlfriend said. Alice told me that he's mentioned how I'm too judgmental and opinionated. He also didn't like that he felt that I and our other mutual friends were trying to interfere with their relationship. To be clear, I wasn't trying to hook up with this girl. I genuinely just didn't want to see my friend hurt. But she continued seeing him as a friend with benefits long after people told her to be wary, and at that point, I wasn't spending energy to try and nudge her. At some point though, she did break things off for good with him. The timeline is a little messy here, but in between the above incidents, I get a text from Marvin saying that he took acid and came to the realization that he's a sociopath. He then tells me some sad story about his family and says if he can't make himself become empathetic and feel things deeply, he would just kill himself. Being naive and not wanting anyone to die, I tell him that there's plenty of people who just want surface-level connections, so he doesn't need to kill himself. He can just find other people like him. Looking back, I realize no one tells people they're a sociopath unless they're trying to scare them. And he probably told me this because he knew that Alice talked to me. He never thought much about her intellect, and he probably figured that I was the one who told her the theory that he's a sociopath. We fall out of touch after their full breakup, and with him hiding after the theft incident, and I deleted his number. At some point though, we connect on Facebook, and he basically tells me that he got addicted to coke while doing criminal business in Europe. He went to rehab and claims a psychiatrist diagnosed him as a psychopath. Of course, using the term more likely to be linked with violent behavior, and one that's not even a clinical diagnosis. My stomach sank. I didn't know how to react to this. I asked him how it made him feel to know for sure, and he said that it made him aware of his power. He then said that he respects me and would never hurt me, and I just blocked him not long after this. My last mutual contact with him was him texting me in 2012. His message was vague and provocative. He said, "I'm coming." I asked who this was, and he dodges the question to coax me to admit that I knew. I asked what he wants and that I don't appreciate feeling threatened. He told me that I'm so defensive and that he just wanted to say hi to me. and I told him that I think it's uncool that he's trying to mess with me because I have a weaker ego than him. He says something strange about how I should never talk down about myself or something like that. Well, I just blocked his number again. This was 2012, and since then, 2 or 3 times a year, I'll get an Instagram follow request from a new profile he's created. Sometimes, it's obviously him, and sometimes, it will be a weird spam-looking profile, but following mutual or former friends. My heart rate goes up every time that this happens. Sometimes I don't block right away because I don't want to make it obvious how much this puts me on the edge. I usually keep my social media on private, but once, I opened my Twitter so I could participate in some contest, and I kid you not, within 3 days, a faceless account only following a few accounts starts following me again. He's made a Spotify account and followed me, and Spotify doesn't let you block people, so instead, I just had to restrict what I share. I've often thought about starting a podcast, but this whole ordeal has made me hesitant to ever want to raise my profile to a point of being found by him. A friend of ours committed suicide a few years ago, and I'm ashamed to say that I almost didn't go to the funeral in case he showed up. I get terrified when I get calls from strange numbers. I got worried that I'd bump into him when I believed that we were both in my hometown at the same time. I don't know what his goal is, and that's what bothers me the most. Is this his punishment for me for getting involved in his affairs over a decade ago? On the one hand, he's never made overt threats to me. He knew where I lived growing up, and I was there for many years after our last conversation. I spent many nights concerned when strange cars parked outside, but thankfully I never had an issue. On the other hand, I don't know what he's capable of, and if he's connected to dangerous people. He's moved back and forth between our hometown and other places several times, and apparently changed his name along the way. My therapist suggests that perhaps he envies my large circle of deep relationships, as he clearly has issues with his own identity. But it's disturbing for me that I'm still on his mind after a decade of not communicating. I keep praying that he finds someone else to fill his boredom, then making sure that I don't forget he's out there. My friends have told me that it's silly to worry about this, but it's hard when I'm having a good day and suddenly see an Instagram notification that sucks the oxygen out of the room. I've spent 10 years anxious and in fear because of his cruelty, and I honestly wish that he kept his word about what he'd do if he couldn't find a way to be a normal human being. Way back whenever I was a little boy, me and my family used to make the drive from our home to my grandparents' house up north, and then we would stay there for the end of the year into the beginning, and then we would head back south. Honestly, I don't remember how long it took to get from point A to point B, but I remember it being a long time, and of course, as a kid, it always felt like it took forever, and I would get increasingly impatient on the ride there. Because of that, my parents always tried to make stops when I would hit my peak. Obviously, I was very young, maybe 7 at the oldest, so it wasn't like I was older and throwing a tantrum. I was still a pretty young boy and really didn't like sitting still. There was one rest stop between home and my parents' house that I really liked stopping at because they had some really neat animal statues out front near a small playground area, and there was a McDonald's that was actually built in the parking lot area of that certain rest stop. When you're at that age, who doesn't love colorful animals and McDonald's, right? And fortunately, my appreciation for the place very quickly went away when the incident that I'm writing about occurred, mostly because I was terrified that it would happen again, however unlikely that actually was. That year, we were driving up to my grandparents' house as we always did for the holidays, and in that year, my mom was actually pregnant with my sister, so we were stopping more than we usually did. We then got to the area where the rest stop that I mentioned above is, and I asked my dad if we were going to see the statues. At this point, it was starting to snow a bit, and my dad mentioned that he wouldn't mind stopping, but that we couldn't play on the playground because of the weather. I was a bit upset at this. I wanted to play out in the snow, but he was pretty steadfast about the fact that we would stop, take some pictures, get our snacks and whatnot, and then get back on the road. We pulled into the rest stop and the snow was starting to come down a bit more, and it was starting to stick to everything. There were also small patches of ice in various spots as well from when it was raining before the snow. We parked, all got out, and my dad started heading towards the statues, warning us of a slick spot on the walkway so we didn't slip. He wanted to quickly get his annual photograph of the family around the big brown bear statue and then get out of there. And as we were heading toward the statue, I got hit with the urge to go to the bathroom, like really bad. I told my dad that I had to go, and he asked me if I could wait, but it was a nuclear threat at that point, like if I didn't go right then and there, I was going to need new pants. This was one of those rest stops where the restrooms weren't in the building, they were on the outside, so he told me to go ahead and go, and that they would be waiting right there when I got out. I ran to the men's room and I did my business. When I got out, I noticed that there was an older man in the restroom at one of the urinals, but I ignored him and I walked past him to get to the sink so that I could wash my hands. It was while I was washing them that this man stepped away from the urinal to get behind me, which, looking back, I realized now that he didn't adjust his pants or flush, so I don't think he was really going. It was like he was just standing at the urinal to wait. I didn't notice it back then because I was honestly not paying attention. I was just trying to wash my hands and be done with it. I look in the mirror and he and I make eye contact, and I see that he is staring at me with a very happy grin on his face. I tried to look away, but the minute that I made eye contact, he moved to initiate conversation. He looked down at me and he said, "Hey, how are you enjoying this weather, huh?" I was enjoying it as I loved the snow and we didn't get a lot of it where I lived. So I smiled and I said that I liked the snow and that it was neat. The man laughed and said that he used to like the snow too until he got old. I made a comment about how I would always like the snow, and he once again just laughed. I finished washing my hands and I went over to get a paper towel, and this guy followed me over towards the door and just kept talking about the weather and asking about if I liked to play in the snow and such. It really felt like this was just some old guy that was making conversation with me about the snow, and I wasn't feeling scared of him, and being like 7 at that time, he kind of reminded me of my grandfather too. I wasn't feeling like I needed to run or be scared of him. But then, all hell seemed to break loose. I finished drying my hands and I went to exit the restroom. The man was behind me, so I held the door open to be polite. But as soon as I stepped away from the door, he literally swung his arm around me and then picked me up and started running toward the parking lot. I think he looked older than he really was, because if he was my grandpa's age, then I don't think he would have been able to grab me and run like he did. And as soon as I realized what was going on, I started screaming as loudly as I possibly could. My dad heard me. He saw what was happening and he started running towards us. But this guy had a lead and he was heading straight for a car that was in the parking lot. And it looked like he was going to get there before my dad would be able to catch up to him. And that's when fate took over and I was saved by a miraculous twist. This man that was carrying me was paying a lot of attention to getting to his car and not a lot of attention to the ground in front of him. He ended up catching his foot on that ice patch that I mentioned before, and because I was kicking and shifting his weight, he slipped, and when he slipped, he went head first into his own car. Thankfully, I pretty much just fell to the ground, but this man smacked his head on the bumper of his vehicle, and he was out cold. It honestly felt like it played out like a comedy movie with how it happened, though nobody was laughing. My dad grabbed me and started shouting for someone to call 911, mostly because this guy looked like he was pretty messed up. The police and an ambulance showed up and they took him away and the officers took our statements. I have no idea if the man made it or if he was really messed up, but in my opinion, he kind of had it coming. I don't wish ill on anyone really, but this man tried to kidnap me. And well, like I said, fate took over. I don't like thinking about what would have happened if he hadn't fallen, but I think it's pretty obvious that it wouldn't have been good. I'm thankful that it didn't go that far, but I will say that this event really ruined that rest stop for me and made me afraid to do anything alone in public. Okay, so this happened to me earlier, and I don't think I'll be sleeping tonight. I'm currently staying in a remote part of the United Kingdom and having a break from working, which means more time to pursue my hobbies. One being photography. I had scoped out a creepy-looking tree formation in a nearby forest and set my camera and tripod up as the sun was coming down, for the extra creepy vibe. As I'm happily taking photos, I see a woman pass the entrance to the arched trees. This woman had parked her car next to mine when I arrived. She went past a couple of times, looking at me for prolonged periods with each time she passed. I assume that she wants to come up this path, but she sees that I'm taking photos, so she decides to walk elsewhere. Approximately 5 minutes go by though, and she appears again, this time walking towards me, dragging her left side slightly with a strange limp. She stops once and then stares at me for a few seconds, and then starts walking towards me again. I ask her if she's okay. I'm starting to put my camera away at this point and readying my tripod to use for self-defense if necessary, because the vibe that I'm getting about this is way off. And then she starts grunting at me, and then stops and stares again. It's at this point that this woman is close enough for me to realize that she's actually a man in a woman's clothing with a wig. An uncomfortable moment passes, and she starts grunting again. She walks towards the edge of the path, grabs a pile of leaves, and starts throwing them around. She grunts some more and then walks off aimlessly into the forest. I call my friend to tell her what has happened and ask that she stays on the phone in case this person comes back. I'll just take a couple more photos and then I'm out. For a good 10 minutes, I hear the crunching of leaves circling me in the forest, and I just convinced myself that it's the wildlife. And then, silence. I take the photos, and I haven't seen or heard the person for about 15 minutes now, so I assume that I'm safe. I leave the path and see the car has gone. Thank God. However, I quickly notice that there is a man walking towards me from the entrance. It's the same freaking guy. He has changed into men's attire, and as he walks past me, he shoots me a grin that sends shivers down my spine. I don't scare easily, but this guy just gave off all the wrong signals, causing this overwhelming feeling of dread to wash over me. I'm still on the phone at this point and holding my tripod over my shoulder just in case. I quickened my pace and I got back into the car. And as I did, I saw him come out of the lane that I had been down. He stopped and then looked around, then started walking towards my car with intent. I video for a while and then I haul the fuck out of there, driving past this car that he had moved down the road and thinking, what in the gray beard fuck just happened? Limping, leaf-throwing, forest stalker. I hope we don't meet again. To set the stage for this story, we must go back to the far-off year of 1988. The location is the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. I was 10 years old, and with me was my mom, my dad, my best friend, and our golden retriever, Amber. We were very much an outdoor family and had many camping trips before this and since. But to this day, when I think about it, I still remember the terror that I felt that weekend so long ago. After a brief talk with my father recently, it kind of came back to the front of my mind. He also was able to fill in a few details that I had forgotten. This holiday was like many others. We packed up the station wagon with everything we would need for a hike into one of our favorite lakes to camp at. To make this trip even more exciting for me was the fact that it was my birthday weekend and I got to pick this lake. After we arrived at the trailhead and got our packs on, my dad got his sidearm out and strapped it on his belt. In Oregon, open carry was permitted in national forest, and my dad always had a gun on his hip while inside the woods, which always added a sense of security for us. We had a close call with a bear one time, in which it came handy to us. The lake was about a 4-mile moderate hike in through some thick forest, but the trail itself was well maintained and was never busy, so it was going to be a very pleasant hike in. We started off on our hike, and back in the 80s, it was not uncommon to have your dog off leash on the trails in the forest, so we just let Amber run and do her thing. She was a good dog, and she never ran off for too long or jumped on people. She did love people though, and speaking of people, we had not seen anyone else on the trail after about 2 miles in on the hike, which was actually nice, since it was just all of us talking, laughing and enjoying nature. My best friend and I started to hike ahead of everyone else because we were so energized and excited about finding the first and best tent spot once we got to the lake. Amber was bounding ahead of us and having a great time too. We were about 20 yards ahead of my parents when Amber stopped dead in her tracks. I thought maybe she saw a chipmunk or something, maybe a bird. But her hackles came up and she let out the lowest of growls. She never growls. So we stopped walking, and I thought maybe a bear or deer or something was just off the trail, and she saw or heard it. We immediately started walking backwards, and my parents caught up to us. My dad asked us what was going on, and I told him that Amber is up the trail and is growling at something. He tells us girls to stay back with my mom, and he walks ahead to where Amber was at on the trail. My dad gets up to her and looks around. I hear Amber whimper a bit while looking off the trail. My dad comforts her and then calls her back, and then he walks back to us. He says that it must have been an animal and he did not see anything right off the trail or ahead of us. He says to let him take the lead, and then we continue to hike. It didn't take long before it was forgotten though, and Amber and the rest of us are all having a good time again. We arrived at the lake, and much to my delight, there was no one else there camping. The water was clean and blue, and the shade from the trees made the whole scene just perfect. My friend and I found the best spot to set up our tent, and my parents followed suit. After we had camp set up, my folks went off to fish just down the hill, and my friend and I took off with Amber to walk around to the other side of the lake to catch salamanders. We only made it about 1/8 of a mile when Amber stopped and started to growl again. We stopped and looked around and heard brush rustling. And then, right in front of us, a man walked out of the trees. Amber stayed right by our side and started to bare her teeth. He was taller than my dad, so at least 6'4". He was very skinny, but had very broad shoulders. He was clean cut and was wearing black jeans and a white polo shirt with loafers. I mean, he did not look like he had hiked at all or was even dressed for the outdoors. He almost looked like he came out of church. We just stood there trying to process the situation when Amber began to bark. The guy just stood there, not moving. And then he smiled. Like the creepiest smile. It felt like someone who thought that was what a smile was supposed to look like. Amber kept barking, and this got my parents' attention, and they looked up to us and called us to come back. We complied, and we started to walk back towards them. My dad met us halfway and then told us to go back to the campsite, and he was going to talk to this guy. We got back to our camp, and my mom sat with us. I could hear my dad asking the guy if he needed help or was he a fellow camper who had just set up a camp away from the lake. My dad was being very polite and calm, but I could see that he was on guard and trying to feel out the situation. Now is the time to mention that my dad was an ex-army and can be very intimidating when needed. The conversation continues. The guy told my dad that he was just on a walk and he did not mean to intrude on us. The guy then says goodbye and then walks back into the woods. My dad walked back to the camp, sat down, and then told us that he thinks the guy may just be a yuppie camper and does not know much about the outdoors. But my dad said that he got a weird vibe off of him and would be keeping an eye out for him. Amber stayed by our side and was calm, yet she kept looking towards the direction that the guy went. A bit more time goes by, and we have a nice campfire going, and the sun was starting to set. We cooked some dinner and made s'mores afterwards. My friend and I decided to go to our tent and read some books and tell each other some scary stories. Amber followed us to the tent and laid right outside of the door. My parents walked down to the lake to sit and have a beer and just chill out. They were never more than 50 yards away. But not long after that my parents walked away, I hear Amber start to growl again. And then we hear footsteps coming from the woods behind our tent. My friend and I turn off our flashlight and go quiet to listen. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the woods, and we then hear heavy breathing and a grunting sound. Amber starts to bark, and we then hear the footsteps retreat to the woods. Amber whimpers a bit, and I then hear my parents walking back to the camp. I go out and tell them what happened, and my dad said that he heard Amber barking, and that is why they came back up. I asked my dad what we should do, what is going on, and if that strange guy was the one creeping around. He then tells me that we will see about moving camp in the morning since we still have 3 days left on the trip and nothing has happened to warrant just leaving. But he also said that we will play it by ear and just to be a little more vigilant, and if something changes, we will decide what to do next. He then tells us to try to get some sleep, and we all turn in for the night. The next morning, we get up, have breakfast, and after breakfast, we head down to the lake to fish. It was a beautiful day, and we were having so much fun that the events from the prior day were almost forgotten. We decided around lunchtime that we would go for a short hike to the waterfall that is up from the lake. We were gone for only about an hour, but when we came back, we found our tents open and our sleeping bags dragged out on the ground. My dad tells us to hang back with Mom, and he goes to investigate. He comes back and says that nothing is missing, but it was not an animal that did this. He says we should break camp, hike back to the car, and then find another spot to camp for the next couple of days. I could tell that my dad was not wanting to frighten us, but I heard the urgency in his voice. I was very disappointed, but if it meant that we could enjoy the rest of the trip and not worry about some creep messing with us, then it was worth it. We broke camp and we started our hike back. Dad was in the lead and we were double timing it, and then we made it back to the car in record time. As we walk over to the car, we see that one of our tires was flat. Not a big deal, we always had a spare. But when my dad bent down to start taking the lugs off, we swore it was not just flat. Someone slashed the tire. Dad changed the tire in record time and we threw everything onto the car, but he then goes to turn the car on, but it wouldn't start. Dad swears. He gets out of the car and then pops the hood up. He then says, "Shit." It turns out someone took our spark plug wires. Old cars like that Chevy wagon did not have internal hood releases. You could just pop the hood from the outside. Dad slams the hood, says some very colorful words, and then kicks some rocks. We were stuck, and no one else was at the trailhead. We were stranded. My parents are calm under pressure, and after a few minutes of discussion, it was decided that Dad would start walking down the road until he could hitch a ride to town and then go to the auto parts store. Mom and the rest of us were going to wait with the car and look for someone to hopefully pull into the trail ahead and then help us. A few hours go by, and no one has come to the trailhead. It was getting hot, and we were hungry and tired. My mom makes us some lunch, and then we go sit under a tree to cool off. Amber is by our side and was calm. But then, we hear a voice. Amber leaps up and then starts to whimper. The creepy guy from yesterday comes down the trail and is asking my mom if we need help. My mom tells him that we're fine and that it's being settled and my dad will be back soon. This creep then tells her that his camp is closed and that he is parked on the old fire road that is near the lake and asks us if we would like to come back to his camp and then wait until my dad returns. My mom sternly tells him no, that we will just wait here and thank you anyway. But he does not like this. He tells my mom that it's not safe out here for a pretty lady and 2 young girls. My mom, like my dad, is no pushover and asserts herself again that we do not need any help and to please just leave us alone. The guy just stands there, smiles wide, and then just turns around and leaves. My mom is visibly shaken, and us girls were just a bit scared. My mom then comes over to us and tells us that we need to stay close, to not wander, and that we will be okay. My friend and I are really kind of freaked out, and we're just hoping that my dad will make it back soon. After about another 30 minutes, the creepy guy comes back, but this time though, he is not alone, and he has a slightly younger guy with him. The other guy is dressed as a yuppie camper and had a very stern look on his face. My mother stands her ground as they approach. Amber starts to low growl and her hackles go up. The two guys flank us, and one of them flashes a gun tucked into his belt. The older guy tells us that we need to go with them and that they were not asking. My mom backs up next to us and without taking her eyes off of them, reaches to her belt and pulls out her Bowie knife. My mom said that we will not be going and that they need to leave now. The two men did not even flinch at this and said that we will come with them or they will hurt us. At this moment though, Amber goes up from just growling to barking and then puts herself between us and them. This makes the guys stop. My mom yells that they need to leave now, and they start backing up, and at that moment, we hear a truck pulling into the trailhead parking lot. At the side of the truck, the guys start to walk away fast and then disappear into the tree line. The truck was a forest ranger, and he had my dad with him. My dad jumped out of the truck and then ran over to us, asking if we were okay. The ranger came over and asked who those men were and if we were okay too. My mom explained everything while my dad hugged us girls and told us that we will be okay. The ranger takes off to go looking for the men. My dad then tells us that he was about 5 miles from the town when the ranger picked him up and then took him the rest of the way to get the part for the car. He then drove him back to our car. But after hearing what happened, my dad was pissed and he wanted to find the guys who tried to kidnap us and that had been terrorizing us for the past 24 hours. The ranger came back and told us that he had almost caught up to them, but then they sped away in their truck with a camper in tow. They had been parked behind a small ridge behind the lake on an old logging road. He did not get a plate, but he radioed a description of the men and their truck and camper to the local sheriff's office. He also took our information and said that he would pass it on to them. He waited with us until Dad had fixed the car, and then we were able to leave. We decided not to continue camping, and instead drive a couple of hours to spend the last 2 days of the trip at the beach and just stay in a hotel. A few days later, a deputy called my dad and told him that they never did find the men. He said that it was most likely a crime of opportunity after seeing a woman with 2 girls in tow. He was sure that they had been watching us from off the trail and had messed with our camp to judge how my dad would react. When my dad seemed to be too big of a threat, they sabotaged our car, hoping to put us in a position where we were vulnerable. He said that they would follow up with us if they found out anything else, but according to my dad, nothing ever came of it. Years later, I tried to do some research on crimes in that area of Oregon during the 80s that might have involved something like what we experienced. All I could find was a few reports of campers being robbed and a few cars broken into. There was one case of a young lady and her dog going missing from an area near there, but it was never determined what happened to her, or even if it was something bad, or she just ran away. I can tell you that we did go back to that lake a few years later, and we had a very uneventful camping trip. It was nice to go back and find some joy in a spot that was special to me. I really hope those creepy guys never hurt anyone, and maybe were caught for other crimes. I will never know though. I just hope to never run into a situation like that again. I can say that having a dog along with us helped our situation. She was the hero and kept us alert. Amber went on to live until she was 12 years old and passed with her favorite people around her. Remember to stay safe, stay watchful, and it never hurts to have a sweet, brave dog with you. In 2020, I met this guy at a mall that I worked at. He owned one of the stores at the mall, and it was a tech store to repair phones. Anyways, I would see him often because the office was close to his store. To be specific, it was right across from each other. One day, he came up to me and asked for my name. We made some small talk, and then we exchanged numbers. We started seeing each other. One night, I was so tired from work that I didn't want to go to dinner with him anymore. I'm a single mom and I get burned out easily. I told him that I didn't want to go anymore, and he said, "No, get ready. I already made the reservations." I said flat out no because I was exhausted, and I'm the type to refuse to be forced into doing anything, and being controlling is such a turn-off. So I was already getting ready to dump him. I said no firmly, and he responded by saying that he's on his way. I said, "Well, I'm not going, so waste your gas if you want to." I didn't think he would come, but of course, he came. He showed up to my apartment and was non-stop honking outside. He was calling and texting me non-stop, and I threatened to call the cops if he didn't stop. I called the cops for a noise complaint, and as soon as he heard the sirens, he then sped off. I remember waking up the next morning to 60 text messages and 100 missed calls saying, "I can't believe you stood me up. I love you. What is wrong with you? I just wanted to spend time with you." The list goes on, but it really made me see him in a different, weird, creepy light. Because how do you love me if we've only been dating for 2 months? We weren't in a relationship at all. Well, at least in my eyes we weren't. Yes, we did have sex already after the first 2 weeks of seeing each other. What scared me was I remembered that when we had sex, he said he was a virgin. I'm starting to believe he actually was because of how things are starting to escalate. After he told me that he was a virgin, I didn't have sex with him again. So out of the 2 months, we only had sex once. He's Muslim, and his parents are very strict and crazy that he would sneak out to see me all the time, even though he was 24 at that time. So after that night of him honking, I broke it off with him, and I called him a psycho. I told him that I don't ever want to see him again. Now, we are in 2023, and ever since 2022 to now, he goes through weird mental states where in certain months, he will blow up my phone, but he'll do it once out of like 6 months, basically out of the blue, and I just never respond to it. Until one day in October, he sent an apology saying that he's sorry and that he's moved on, and he knows that he was acting crazy, blah blah blah, and that he just wanted to be on good terms as friends. He asked me if he can take me to dinner and make up for what he's done. I thought he was being honest because I hadn't heard from him in months, so I said okay, and I went to dinner with him. It was the biggest mistake of my life because before we got the food, he literally got on his knees and begged for me to never leave him again and that he was in love with me. I've never been so scared and freaked out in my life. I ate in silence to keep my cool, and I stood silent because I didn't know what he was capable of anymore, and I didn't want him to snap. I said that I don't feel good and I wanted to go home, so he drove me home. Once I got out of the car, I was so relieved, and I promised to myself that I would never talk to him again. And I never spoke to him again. Ever since October of 2022, he has been texting my phone once or twice a week, asking to go to dinner, and I never responded because he makes me sick to my stomach. I moved houses, thank God, so he doesn't know where I live. But recently, he's been texting me to go to dinner again. The last text was December 30th, and prior was the week before, that it's just been very consistent. But recently, on Friday, January 6, 2023, 2 days ago, he took a picture of me while I was working and then sent me the picture. It scared the hell out of me because how could he know where I worked? I just switched to a different salon and he didn't know the salon prior where I worked at. At least, I don't think he knew that I've only been at the salon for 2 or 3 weeks. It makes no sense, and my heart dropped to my ass when I saw the picture. I responded and said, "You're stalking me, leave me alone already." He said that he has a limo service and that he was just driving around when no way in hell he could have seen me through the window because my station was in the second station. He zoomed in to take the pic. I called the police and they basically victim blamed me. They said, "How do you not know the last name of the guy you dated or his home address?" They said that since I didn't know his last name or his address, I can't file a restraining order or an order of protection. Please, help. I know the laws are different in every state, but I'm in Chicago, Illinois, and I don't know what he's capable of. So, where to even begin? In my country, the government decided to push free professional classes to anyone who's either benefiting from welfare or just unemployed. I, a 30-year-old female, decided to enroll in one of those classes before moving to another state next year, just to have something more on my CV and to have an excuse to touch grass since I'm unemployed. And I specifically picked a social media marketing and management formation that started 3 months ago. Everything was great about it, and it seemed to me that all my classmates and professors were great people, and I even started to make some friends. I must point out though that no one in my class is underage, the youngest being 21 and the oldest being 56. After a couple weeks of classes, they introduced us to the main curriculum of the whole course that will involve a months-long group project among all the students. The project consists in inventing a brand from the ground up and then market it on social media as if it's a real thing about to launch on the market. I was super excited about this, and I couldn't wait to face this challenge. They picked the groups at random, and the RNG gods chose for me to be paired with a 56-year-old woman. We'll call her M, as she barely spoke to anyone up until that point. Thinking she was nothing but a nice lady, I tried to accommodate her for any preferences that she would have on the project, such as choosing what the topic would be about. But then, she immediately starts telling me half of her life story, just out of nowhere, and then focused particularly about a skin issue that she had that she claimed the doctors only made worse, and how she cured herself with herbs and essential oils. In hindsight, this was already the first red flag. Her rambling just left me scratching my head, and just to break the awkward silence, I said that we could pick that as a brand idea. Natural remedies, food supplements, and cosmetics brand that's not some MLM or a cult. And she immediately agreed and smiled like a little girl, which back then made me kinda happy. After, she then picked a name, the idea for the logo and the motto without asking me for an opinion, saying that it felt so important to her, and that since I have no experience with this niche, I should just learn from her. She insisted so much that I had to comply, and that's when hell started for me. She would call and message me on WhatsApp constantly, insisting to see me work in real time on the designs, the logos, and the mock-ups, because she needed to supervise my actions. Her excuse being that I'm a little girl that hasn't known the world yet. She never liked any of my works and forced me to redo things over and over and over again. I'm on the spectrum, and I have a very hard time setting boundaries with people or dealing with the idea of displeasing someone. So I just kept pushing myself to stay strong and keep going because I couldn't deal with how this woman would have reacted to anything that she might have seen as insubordination, on top of the fact that I didn't want to fail the course. And from the beginning, all of our professors insisted that the group project was vital to the final score. It's in one of those calls, though, that she starts telling me some of the most unhinged shit that I have ever heard in my life. After seeing me drink a sip of an energy drink, she screamed at me to toss that garbage away, and then starts to explain to me the reason why. In her opinion, energy drinks, sodas, and junk food are infested with nano machines that infect the human body and then rewrites their DNA. She then explains that that's because the great powers are not aliens like most think, but androids and AI hive minds ready to enslave humanity through biomechanical control. She also keeps going on how great men in history were actually androids or giants. She did go on a great tangent about Nephilims and such. She also threw in the fact that she's sure that dinosaurs are nothing but a fairy tale and could have never existed. The first incident, and the biggest one, happened last month. On one weekend evening, where instead of slaving away for her, I went out with my mom to visit some friends and be back home the next morning. I forgot my phone at home, and I realized that too late. But since Em and I hadn't agreed to work that night, I thought nothing of it. Oh man, was I naive. My phone was blown up with messages and phone calls, all from Em, except a couple messages from another classmate of mine that told me that she had called him obsessively with demands of him showing up at my front door to make sure that I was okay, because he had mentioned before that we lived on the same block. And later that weekend, I get called into the school administration because Em apparently had called them too and told them that I had gone missing for 3 to 4 days. I tried in vain to keep it together, but I just bursted into tears in front of the secretaries, telling and showing them all this woman was putting me through, explaining my boundaries, setting issues, and they decided to immediately inform the professors and find a solution that would have allowed me to not have any more contacts with her. But before they could take any actions, me and Em are informed of one more student that was going to join our group. We'll call him T. There's not much to say about him. He's super nice, and he did help out the following week by not complying to Em's demands and unreasonable standards, insisting that I take time off to do my own things too. For some reason though, she never bitched about decisions made by T. In my last call with Em and T, Em goes on another unhinged rant. This one will be relevant later, and it's what makes this story so messed up on multiple levels. She claims she's being gang-stalked and sabotaged by big pharmacies because she had invented a miracle ointment that could reconstruct any sort of biological tissue. She said that she tested it on the hand of a friend of hers that had third-degree burns, claiming that she saw the nerves, the tendons, and the muscles and the skin grow back, saving her friend's hand. She then added that a prototype of said ointment that mostly consists of garlic and aloe cured her husband from cancer a few years back. She also added how after an accident over a decade ago, the doctors decided to sabotage her uterus during an emergency surgery to to prevent her from having children. More of the big pharma sabotages involved several lawsuits that she was involved in. And she concludes that she's taking SMM classes with us because she wants to learn how to communicate with social media and the new generations. I'm personally afraid that she's gonna try to scam desperate people into buying her bullshit garlic and aloe miracle cure. The second incident happened the next day before class. A friend decided to sit next to me since that class of the day wasn't going to involve the group projects. We put our stuff on the desk, and since we were early, we decided to go into the next room to get some coffee. M comes in, and then we hear a commotion in the classroom. When we peek inside, we see her tossing my friend's stuff to another desk. My friend asked her what the hell she was doing, and M just coldly responded, "The seat next to her is mine." I nodded at my friend as if to say that it's okay, to try and defuse the situation before it escalated. 2 days later, we get informed that I was swapped from M's group to another one. I will say that finally, I'm working with a girl that I made friends with, and we're having a lot of good fun. So, well, I thought it was over. No more of M's weird shit, right? Right? Well, the calls and the messages from her never ended. Actually, she started obsessively calling the school and the professors as well to protest about the decision of removing me from her group. Her texts were filled with weird trivial questions about random topics or very personal questions, up to 50 to 60 texts per day. At this point, I stopped responding almost entirely to her, and I'm screenshotting everything that she was sending me. This leads us to the third and last incident, at least so far. That happened last week. I can't go too much into detail because it involves geopolitical beliefs, and I don't want a war in the comments. The short, clean version of events is, M, in class, asked the professor a question that involved a very important global matter. He replied, and then asked us about our opinion. 2 people spoke before I did, giving examples of people or brands getting cancelled for sharing political stances unwisely, and how a problematic or controversial history or presence on social media might impact negatively on one's chances of employment. It was only once back home that I realized that M had sent me several rage-filled texts claiming that I was incredibly rude to have answered to her instead of letting the professor answer, and that she was expecting my apologies. I wrote a long text to her explaining myself, told her that I would not apologize since I had done nothing wrong, and I finally blocked her number. She thankfully hasn't been able to find me on social media yet because I don't use my real name online. Since then, she's been missing all classes, which is actually nice because I really didn't want her to try and confront me in person. But it's what I've learned today from one of my classmates during break that left me horrified and pushed me to write this post. One of my classmates, we'll call her Y, told me that M and her had been exchanging texts from time to time, mostly because Y took pity on M, thinking, like I did at first, that she was just some weird old and lonely lady. In one batch of texts, she goes into detail about her husband that had passed away from cancer a few years back. Some of the texts read, "We fought tooth and nail. We didn't bend over to men nor God, but they took him away from me anyway. I was so close to keeping him with me. At least, I know he trusted and followed me until the end." These are verbatim, because after putting 2 and 2 together, me and Y, we figured that she's either, number 1, delusional and lying about everything, and number 2, She tried to cure her husband from cancer with her ointment instead of traditional medicine, effectively killing him. Also, we found out that she's already selling her services inside of an SPA belonging to a relative of hers, using the name she picked for our project. She has also been using my work for her personal social media pages involving her services, which explains why she was so obsessive about supervising my work. She was basically getting free commissions out of me. Today was my last day of class before the Christmas holidays, and after that, it's just gonna be 3 more months until classes are over. I don't know where this story will lead me to further, but honestly, I hope she never shows up to class ever again. I'm really hoping to not have to come back with more updates. Update. So, I don't even know where to begin. I will have to leave out some details because she went too far with one of my classmates, and all I can say is that her actions affected a minor, and M has been reported to the police by the person in question. But it seems that the police hasn't taken the situation seriously, despite being pretty damn serious. She apparently isn't new to this kind of behavior, since she has had multiple convictions in her life before, and some restraining orders against her. But in my country, those are barely ever enforced. As far as her actions against me, I have been successfully ignoring her, although I feel that she's trying her best to upset me in class, just to get a reaction out of me or something, like purposely sitting behind me and making tapping or humming and loud comments often, which was something she never did before. I think she might have caught on to the fact that I'm uncomfortable around overstimulating noises, and unfortunately, I'm forbidden from wearing my noise-canceling headphones in class. Ever since I blocked her, I've also been receiving multiple mute phone calls from unknown or unregistered phone numbers, and the same goes for T, that also had to complain to the school administration to have him change groups to stay away from M. In the meantime, she went on to harass almost everyone in class. One day, in between classes, I went out with a handful of classmates to get something to eat in a pub, and that's when we each told our stories of our encounters with her. One of them in particular disturbed me, which is the one that I don't feel comfortable talking about because, as mentioned before, it involves a minor. Another peculiar account is one where she emotionally blackmailed a guy in my class to stay with her at the bus stop for 2 hours, all the while she was telling him some crazy religious shit. Overall, she has been changing her backstory a lot depending on who she spoke to. One time, she had kids taken away from CPS. To others, she said that she can't have kids, like she did with me. And then, she keeps killing or resurrecting her husband in various stories. And when we were done exchanging experiences, we all felt very uncomfortable knowing that we all complained to the school administration for 2 months and no action has been taken whatsoever, except small things that didn't quite solve the issue. The course ends in 1 month, and back in December, I couldn't anticipate how far she would go. Now, I'm quite afraid of what she might push out of her system just to get some last bit of attention. I thought she had just latched onto me because she saw me as weak, but apparently, this person is actually just dangerous and unhinged towards everyone. I wish I could feel terrible for her because she's obviously suffering from some serious mental illness that surely involves some degree of hallucinations and surely huge delusions. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate it. I would also like to give some extra love to my Patreon members, my channel members, and also my tippers. Thank you so much. If you would like to extend a little bit more support for the channel, don't forget to leave a like and a comment down below. If you would like to become a Patreon member, a channel member, a tipper, or even to buy merch, check out the links in the description below. Again, thank you. And I hope you stay scared, because your fear feeds me.